Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening in to our new exclusive podcast series where we deep dive into upcoming as well as leading Web3 projects. And I'm more than excited to have Mark from Aethir with us today. For those of you who don't know, Aethir is one of the leaders in the decentralized GPU space. So thanks so much for jumping on this podcast with me, Mark.
Hey, well, pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Seb.
Fantastic. So to spice things up, I want to start a bit differently, right? So we're going to get into Aethir in a second. But what I found really fascinating about, more or less new to this space, and I'm really fascinated by the different backgrounds, the diversity of people in this space. So I really want to get to know you better, Mark, here. Maybe you can give the audience a better perspective on yourself. Let's start there. Where are you from and where are you based now?
So I am Australian by birth, born in Sydney. Actually left Sydney when I was about 6. My family kind of lived all over the world when I was growing up. Lucky enough to spend most of my life in Asia. It's one of the reasons why I chose to kind of go and found my first company in China. But kind of a product of the APAC region pretty broadly. And I'm now based in Singapore.
Not too bad, Singapore. So you've been around quite a bit, I can see. Starting in your professional journey, I saw that you've done environmental science and civil engineering. So I guess it's not directly Web3. Can you tell us a bit more about that? What brought you into those different fields?
Yeah, I think I've always been fascinated by systems, right? And in particular, I was very fascinated by environmental systems, right? All of the different systems that play in nature, whether it's kind of different kind of natural systems or how natural systems can be used in kind of more artificial or economic ways. I started actually studying biotech and genetics, realized that I kind of didn't want to be wearing a lab coat as I kind of progressed through my career. So transitioned into something that I felt had more real world kind of applications, and then added a business degree onto my science degree to kind of round out the lab coat with a potential for a suit. To be honest, as a young person, I had so many passions and so many things that I was interested in, and absolutely no way to kind of filter down what I thought I wanted to do moving forward. Up until I literally got my first job on kind of the project management side in this kind of engineering and infrastructure space, until that first day in that role, I had absolutely no idea where I was going with my life. I knew that I wanted to be successful, right? As broad of a term as that is, but I had no idea how to get there. It was only really once I kind of sat down in this company and could see people ahead of me, and I could say, okay, I don't like what this guy's doing, but I really like what this guy's doing. How do I get there? And once I get there, how do I get to the next person, right? So I don't know. I'm not one of these people that was kind of born with this vision for exactly what they want to do in life. I really kind of just took as well thought out steps as I could, and then made kind of new adaptations based on where I got with that kind of next step.
So maybe we can give these people that are not familiar with the space that you were in formerly a bit of an understanding of what it's like. So you've been involved in the Wheatstone project, which has, again, nothing to do with Web3 so far. Maybe you can give...
Yeah, probably never. Probably never going to get involved in Web3.
Centralized energy, at least. So who knows? Anyway, so maybe you can give the people an idea of what that was about and what your role was in this.
Yeah, so I worked for a company called Bechtel, right, which are this EPCM, essentially an engineering project management company. They build massive projects, the projects that almost no other company in the world can build, and Wheatstone was one of those. It started as a $25-30 billion project, ended up being somewhere in the realm of like 40 to 50 billion, right? Projects of that size are extremely uncommon, right? Particularly when it's a single facility. So there isn't really anyone out there that can build the whole entire thing, you really need to pull in an expert like Bechtel, and then they'll look at the entire job and break it down into a series of pieces, get other companies that are experts in building those pieces, right? So a company that's an expert in building LNG tanks, a company that's experts in building underground piping or electrical or whatever the different scopes of work are. They'll bid those out. Maybe each of those scopes of work is in excess of $1 billion themselves, right? And then they'll parachute in a small-ish team of a couple of hundred people that will kind of oversee all of these contracts, right? Yeah, smallish team. I think at peak on project, there was maybe 7,000 to 8,000 people living in this very remote, isolated location, and maybe 500 to 600 were Bechtel at absolute peak, right? But it's really just a kind of a very small number of people overseeing a very large subcontract doing incredibly technical things. What I loved about it, though, was that I started in there in the company on the kind of environmental science and civil engineering side, and very quickly after just a couple of months on the project, realized that there was this incredible opportunity to go and transition and do a whole bunch of different things within the organization, and I took as much advantage of that as I could. So after my first year on the civil side, I actually went and spent a year out on the boats, right? So I was out on vessels doing marine dredging activities and marine environmental science. After that, I transitioned into kind of the electrical and piping side, doing a lot of the underground works on the project. I spent a year on the contracts team, looking after the actual legal side of what the business did. And then I finished my time there doing what was called like turnover, right? So essentially systems completion, taking all of these different systems, making sure they're finished and they're built complete and they're ready for turnover to our customer, who is Chevron. So it was pretty nuts, right? Because I was not an expert in any of those fields, right? And then I was dropped in a room with a bunch of people that were all, kind of gray haired. I was like 23, 24. And, I had to just sit there and not look like an idiot as I was trying to learn as quickly as I could from all these very experienced people. And I think, to be honest, that's what gave me the initial confidence to enter into this kind of entrepreneurship world, right? I'd kind of been dropped into so many experiences with people that were smarter than me, more capable than me in those fields. Yet I felt like I was still able to operate and still able to succeed. And that was kind of a lot of the affirmation that I needed, that entrepreneurship was something I could take on.
Most definitely. I can see that you actually took on yourself, co-founded or founded yourself several projects, or should I say side projects. So really, really curious on your journey there. Also diverse industries. I mean, biometric data tracker, not exactly the same as the Wheatstone project. Then an educational platform, e-commerce business. So like amazing journey there. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first company that I founded was the biomedical device company, right? So that's the company that I left Wheatstone to found. I actually moved to China. I mean, as you know, you've got kind of a couple of different startup hubs in the world, at least as far as kind of mainstream media is concerned, right? You've got maybe San Francisco and the Bay Area, you've got maybe New York. But as far as I was concerned, if you wanted to build something physical, right? If there was a hardware component to what you're building, the best place you could be was in China, next to these factories, adjacent to where all of the building happens. So I looked at kind of what moving to China might look like, and ended up, pulling the trigger and moving to Beijing. Founded that company pretty quickly after and raised some money. To be honest, I was working on that project for 6 to 12 months in my spare time before I left my full-time job. So I was kind of trying to lay the groundwork for the transition as best I could, right? I visited all of these different places. I tried to build networks where I could in the areas that I thought I might end up. And then when I was finally ready to pull the trigger, left Bechtel and moved to Beijing. Probably could have moved to Shenzhen, right? Shenzhen's actually where all of the electronics manufacturing is. It's called the Silicon Valley for hardware. But I didn't really know anyone in Shenzhen at the time. So Beijing was the way to go. And Beijing was absolutely pumping. This was like 2016. You may be familiar with Y Combinator, the big startup accelerator. They opened a Beijing office. It was YC China, right? This was peak share bike and share scooter economy, right? You know, when like Bird was just pumping and all of the share bikes were like popping up all over the world. That originated in China. So at the time, there was this huge, maybe narrative that innovation was flipping from coming from the West and being copied in China to actually maybe originating in China and being copied in the West. And it was a crazy time. You really felt like you're in the center of the universe in Beijing, and it was a cool place to start companies. Very, very cool. So much going on.
I can totally relate. I mean, maybe small anecdote from myself. I did an exchange semester in Shanghai in, I think it was a 2016-ish time as well. And I still remember that I came back a couple years later and everything looked different. It's like overnight that they came up with a new city, you know, it's insane, the growth that they probably still have there.
100%. Totally crazy, but I loved it.
So maybe looking back, you founded a lot of companies, right? I mean, your journey is insane. We'll talk about Aethir in a second, what you did there. To new aspiring listeners here, what would you give as a message? What gave you the confidence to move into these new ventures?
I think there's a lot of research and preparation you can do to kind of de-risk that first step for yourself, right? Just like when people say if you're moving jobs, right? Get that next job ready before you leave your current job. Don't just kind of like quit in a blaze of kind of fury and then find yourself without a job for like 3 months while you're trying to get to that next position, right? I think there's a similar opportunity with entrepreneurship where you can really do as much as you can to prepare before you take that big step away from the stability of income and your career. But that being said, back yourself, right? I don't think any first-time founder, unless you're extremely lucky, has an easy ride. I think entrepreneurship is famously one of the most challenging things you can do. And there are some things you just only learn by doing, right? No one can really teach you how to raise money. No one can really teach you how to, craft the narrative of what you're building and make it resonate with people. You just have to kind of get out there and tell your story, right? And share with people as best you can what you're working on. I think if you are committed to the entrepreneurship journey, then there's so many great resources out there that you can kind of dig into. I mentioned Y Combinator before. They have a free kind of educational program. You can just go through pretty much the courses that they give to the people that actually do Y Combinator itself. You can go and see and read through all of the kind of materials that they share. It's incredibly valuable. But just build whatever you can as quickly as you can and try and figure out a way to validate what you've built in as cheap and as quick of a time frame as possible. And then just start there, right? It's going to be crazy. It's going to be wild. You're going to probably suck at it in the beginning, but that's okay. Everyone starts there.
So with that mindset in mind, let's put a pin in that. What made you go Web3?
So I'd always been fascinated by Web3, right? This was something that was really, really interesting to me. I'd kind of always been a bit of an online computer nerd, right? Whether it was kind of gaming or degen forums. Like I was always just someone that enjoyed being online, and crypto obviously fell, pretty square into that space. So I'd kind of had it as this really strong interest of mine, but not something that I was ever really pursuing from a professional level. When my biotech company was when we were kind of shutting that down, I was kind of looking at what the next step for me was, and I really wanted to get back into infrastructure, right? Infrastructure was kind of where I felt I had like the most to offer. It was where I had the most kind of interest at the time. And there was some really cool infrastructure jobs and projects happening across China. Without getting into too much detail, a lot of it was related to the cloud, right? So I started to get back into that space. And to be honest, the initial idea or the genesis of Aethir as a concept was kind of birthed as a result of the intersection between the work that I was doing in that cloud infrastructure space and the opportunity that my co-founder and I saw in the decentralized kind of compute space. This was kind of obviously before, you and I had the term DeepIn that we could refer to, but certainly the way that decentralized hardware contributed to kind of broader network objectives, and the way that projects like Helium and Filecoin had kind of led the way made me pretty confident that Web3 was the answer to some of these really challenging problems that we had in the cloud computing space.
Makes a lot of sense to me. Totally can resonate with this. I also I think the first project that I ever heard about in Web3 was Helium, because it made a lot of just sense to me. And I definitely think that Aethir is onto something here as well. Maybe you can for those people that don't know yet. So I already said Aethir is one of the leaders in the decentralized GPU space. What is Aethir and what are some of its key offerings?
Yeah, so at Aethir, we're a decentralized GPU infrastructure for AI and gaming companies. The easiest way to think about Aethir is like an AWS, for example, right? Or Google Cloud. But first of all, we only focus on GPUs, right? So we don't do kind of storage like Filecoin, for example. We don't do, broader CPU focused sort of cloud services. We're very focused on just GPUs. And then the secondary difference is that we actually don't own any of the GPUs in our network, right? AWS, Google Cloud, they have to own all of the GPUs within their ecosystem. All of the hardware in AWS is owned by AWS. Even if you had a device that AWS desperately needed, right? You can't rent it to them. You can't just go to AWS and say, hey, would you mind taking this hardware that I know you need and just pay me a reward for kind of you using it? That's not how that sort of infrastructure works, right? But that's exactly what Aethir does, right? We allow people, generally 9 times out of 10, it's enterprises or companies or startups or data centers themselves, right, to contribute infrastructure to our network. And then we create this really, really simple infrastructure layer that allows them to match that compute or match that infrastructure with the broader demand ecosystem out there.
And we mentioned demand ecosystem. Can you tell me, as a newie, what is cloud gaming actually? I'm used to, playing on my Xbox at home, I guess. And some of the games that I do play, I guess, are in the cloud already. But can you give us a quick outline on how this works? Like, what is it?
For sure. So we serve 2 types of customers, right? On one side, we do AI training and inferencing. And on the other side, we serve gaming customers, right? Through what's called real-time rendering. And real-time rendering is a pretty incredible form of technology, often called cloud gaming, right? You may know that companies like Google did Google Stadia, NVIDIA have this platform called GeForce Now. But effectively what cloud gaming is, it's instead of having to install a game on your own computer, right? So let's say you've got a new game, it's like GTA 5, right? It's just come out. I think we all understand if you're going to play that game, you probably need a good computer, right? Or you probably need a PS5 or the latest release of hardware. That's because new games take a high-end device to play effectively, right? Better graphics and everything like that. Well, with cloud gaming, instead of installing the game onto your local device, like your computer or your PlayStation or Xbox, we actually install it in the cloud. And then we stream what is effectively an interactive YouTube video to a user, and then actually in real time feed their input, whether it's keyboard or controller, we feed that input to the computer that's hosting the game in the cloud. The easiest way to visualize it is like a cloud. Let's just say the cloud is a gaming PC. We install the game on that gaming PC in the cloud, and then we take a video of that computer playing the game and we stream you the video. I think everyone's aware of the fact that you don't need a fancy computer to watch YouTube, right? Any computer, any phone, any device can watch streaming video, even if it's in 4K resolution, right? So that's exactly what cloud gaming is. It's effectively taking a game, converting it into an interactive real-time video feed, and then streaming it in an interactive video format to a user, taking away any requirement for them to have high-end hardware, any game on any device.
And I would assume that Web3 is actually a great advantage here because you can serve the edge easier, correct? Because that real-time streaming, I mean, if I'm sitting in the middle of nowhere, probably it's harder for me to get access to a data center that, you know, is in a hub. So Web3 could come in here and reduce latency quite a lot, right?
100%. I mean, in general, distributed compute networks have a big latency advantage over their centralized counterparts. If you think about how a centralized compute infrastructure operates, right? If you own 100 servers, right? First of all, it's very expensive for you to buy these servers. But operating those servers is going to be expensive as well. So you want to minimize your operating costs as much as possible. And the best way for you to do that is put all of that equipment under one roof, right? You can have a smaller number of people manage a larger amount of equipment. You can negotiate better terms with your bandwidth provider, your electricity provider, your rent provider, right? You effectively can reduce the overhead on that equipment as much as possible if you centralize your equipment. However, when you look at how latency is affected by, you know, the real world or physical infrastructure, the biggest impact on latency is how far away is a user from where that hardware is located, right? So if you're a centralized provider and you've put all of your hardware in this one spot, then a small number of people will have a great service, and then the rest will have a progressively worse service, right? Actually, the majority of people within that network will have a poor service because they're not adjacent to that compute infrastructure. But in a decentralized network, right, there's not one owner of the hardware. So there's no advantage for that hardware to be put under the same roof, right? So by definition, as your network gets bigger, you have an increase in the number of locations that the hardware is located. So the chances that a user is going to be closer to one of those compute locations increases. So actually, big decentralized networks have massive performance and latency advantages over their kind of centralized alternatives.
And how does that feed into the demand side? I mean, I totally agree, right? So for bootstrapping, Web3 is perfect. It's just the right tool. It's much more nuanced than, you know, with these huge CapEx expenses, like AWS, I think has like 25 billion excess CapEx. So for demand side of things, Mark, how does this benefit you at Aethir? Like, what is your typical customer? What can you offer? And how is that better compared to let's say, a centralized provider?
Sure. I mean, if we stick with gaming for a second, right? Google Stadia, they had one of the first scaling cloud gaming services, right? But they weren't able to scale that technology outside of the US or Western Europe, right? And that's because they had a subscription price of roughly $20 to $25 a month per user, because it was so expensive to deploy this infrastructure. They needed to offset that cost with a large subscription, monthly subscription, right? The challenge here, though, is the best benefit that you'll see with cloud gaming technology is seen from users that have really low-end hardware, right? And if you're charging a $20, $25 a month subscription, then all of a sudden, the only people that can afford that are people that can also probably afford high-end equipment, right? So what you had was centralized cloud gaming services scaling in areas where people had the ability to pay a high subscription, right? But also, on the other side, already had good equipment, right? So why do they need cloud gaming? Now, what Aethir is able to do is totally reframe the unit economics and actually scale our distributed cloud gaming network across everywhere in the world, right? Across developing markets and developed markets alike, Southeast Asia, Latin America, India, Africa, bringing the technology to places where users actually benefit from getting it, and it's not locked behind a massive kind of subscription fee. What this means is we're able to tap into demand in that region in a way that centralized providers have never ever been able to kind of reach. And when you think about gaming, right, you've got 3.3 billion gamers out there. 2.8 billion are gaming on low-end devices. If you can get those devices, if you can get those users on low-end devices and make them accessible to the biggest AAA gaming companies in the world, that's a massive new untouched market for those publishers and game developers. And that's what Aethir does on the gaming side. On the AI side, I think you're probably much more familiar, or at least very familiar as well. And that is that, to be honest, the main challenge with high performance compute is accessibility, right? Accessibility, price, and then the style of availability that your provider will offer, right? Generally, if you go to a hyperscaler like an AWS, you'll have a price that's anywhere from 2 to 3 times more than you'll see with specialist GPU providers. And on top of that, you'll have a pretty brutal contract with them where you maybe had to pay X amount up front. You've had to lock in your compute for 12 to 18 months, right? It's really hard to forecast this kind of really expensive compute asset when you're a young company. So all of a sudden, you've got a really significant portion of the AI ecosystem that are actively looking for friendlier compute terms. And that's what we kind of see ourselves as being able to provide, right? Access for builders to kind of come in and create within this AI space outside of the kind of walled gardens of big tech.
100%. And maybe we can quickly zoom in on this because I think it's really interesting. You guys obviously have a lot of demand as well, right? So from our side, what we had to learn was that in the cloud industry, direct sales is not always, the thing, right? So usually you have an indirect layer in between, which is either distributors or resellers that you really need the relationship with. Plus, you need software integration, at least from the data side of things, software integration out of the box, right? So these distributors and resellers then go to the company or end customer to sell the software solution, which you are a part of, right? Maybe you can also touch upon that aspect. How crucial is that in gaming and AI as well?
I think, again, maybe starting with gaming, relationships are so important within the gaming space, right? Gaming has some of the biggest fanboys in the world, right? We all know it. We love it. I'm a massive gaming fanboy. Well, guess what? Every person working in the gaming world is a gaming fanboy, right? So the ecosystem that gamer and game developers live and breathe is built on the back of incredibly powerful kind of networks and connections and relationships. So you do really need to be in that space and very, very present to be successful. I don't think it's enough, for example, to just have a cool product, right? You need people that have those relationships that can break you in, that can build on what they already kind of been building through their reputational value over kind of their career to leverage into kind of the value that you can offer the industry. So I think gaming in particular, very kind of closed circuit. So definitely important to have these relationships that you can use to kind of expose your cool product to that market. AI, much newer sector, right? But at the same time, it's absolutely pumped full of cash. And any industry that is seeing this much inflow of capital is going to have 10 million middlemen, right? They're going to be popping up everywhere. Yeah. And that's just a kind of reality, right? It's very, very difficult often to get to the source of the deal. It's a situation where a lot of people like to insert themselves into the deal flow. But I also think the market's incredibly fragmented, right? And that's why middlemen are there. So there's kind of a balance, I think, that you need to play between having something that feels very institutional, right? But also, I think, having the flexibility to work in maybe more boutique ways to deal with these kind of deal makers that are out there helping you kind of reach the end compute buyer.
So I think another aspect that we have in common is that our focus is really on enterprise-grade hardware, right? Can you tell the listeners a bit more about that? Like why enterprise-grade hardware is crucial for your business?
Yeah, I think the origin story of Aethir, right, was one that was built a little bit on the understanding of what, Filecoin and Helium had done, but also on the backbone of kind of the OG crypto project, Bitcoin, right? Everyone had their home PCs, mining Bitcoin, contributing to this kind of broader network objective. And that kind of concept has always been pretty sexy to what we now call the DePIN space, right? Decentralized physical infrastructure. And as a result, a number of kind of DePIN projects, actually probably the majority of DePIN projects traditionally have been built on the back of consumer hardware, whether it's consumer hardware that's purchased by retail or consumer hardware that retail already owns, right? Like Bitcoin, for example. The challenge that kind of we saw when we were putting together Aethir, right, was that when you're building something on the back of consumer hardware, it's really, really difficult to meet the standards of enterprise-grade service offerings, right? It's difficult to convince an enterprise customer that, okay, if you've got a bunch of GPUs in your network, for example, but those GPUs are sitting inside gaming PCs, how can I convince my customer that Seb isn't going to turn off his gaming PC at night, right? Or Seb isn't going to go and watch Netflix of an evening and throttle his bandwidth and limit my ability to pull compute from that network, right? Enterprise requires, or enterprise clients require a very kind of high level of performance and quality and service. And that means, to be honest, in the vast majority of use cases, you can't build your network on the back of purely consumer compute. I think there are very specific and interesting use cases and maybe increasingly valuable use cases for kind of consumer hardware utilization. But certainly when you're talking gaming or AI from a kind of a frontier large language model perspective, you need enterprise capable networks. So at Aethir, that meant we're going to build a DePIN, but every contributor to our network is going to be enterprise capable.
Makes total sense to me, Mark. So a devil's advocate here might ask, okay, Mark, but what do you need a token for?
Sure. I think the token is in two ways kind of incredibly important, right? So first of all, if you go and you look at AWS or Google Cloud or Microsoft Azure, right? And you kind of look at the fundamental offering of all those three companies and you say, what's kind of different between them? And the answer is effectively nothing, right? Same GPUs, same network, same data centers, same subsea cables, right? The fundamentals are all exactly the same. They can build different versions of a stack on top, right? But at the end of the day, they're selling the exact same thing, right? But if you throw Aethir next to those three companies, right, the difference that we have, okay, same GPUs, same data centers, same network infrastructure, right? But we have a token, right? A token is an X factor element when you're building infrastructure that is competing with kind of Web 2 providers, right? It's an element that allows for an injection of subsidies. It's an element that allows you to incentivize certain behavior within your network. And at the end of the day, the token is, the token is something that they're not able to replicate in the same way. So that's kind of one side. And the second is we're building a decentralized network, right? So we don't own the hardware within our ecosystem, right? So that means that there needs to be a level of trust between the network and the providers of hardware within the ecosystem. And that trust can accrue in kind of two ways, right? One is the Web 2 way, right? The Web 2 way is very slow. Okay, let's have a legal contract between you and me. Our lawyers will review this contract. Okay, you're in a country that I haven't dealt with before. Where would arbitration happen if there was an issue? What does legal language need to look like in your country and jurisdiction versus mine, right? How do we pay you, considering you're in a country that I don't have a financial institution kind of network with? It's a slow process. And if you're trying to build a network and onboard as many GPUs and as much infrastructure you can, imagine the bottleneck that would exist if you had to rely on that contractual and financial structure, right? Whereas in Web3, we have smart contracts, right? A fully transparent open ecosystem where if you're a hardware provider, you can go take a look at what Aethir does and know that if you connect your infrastructure to Aethir and you behave in a certain way, automatically, without Aethir having to approve anything, right? Automatically, the network will reward you. And you know that your wallet can receive those rewards. There's no, governmental interference. There's no, financial network connection needed in the Web 2 world between us and wherever you are. So the ability to scale a network efficiently and cost effectively in Web 3 is just so vastly superior. But on top of that, the ability to create a trustless environment where you don't need to trust me. You can trust the network. You'll get paid because the smart contracts will pay you if they recognize you've done the work within the ecosystem.
And I guess the final element, so we have the decentralized hardware, enterprise grade, we have the token as an incentivization mechanism. I think the final element that's still missing in the puzzle piece here for Aethir is Aethir Edge, right? And the checker nodes. It's so overused these days, node sales. Like, what made this stand out as the one element that you still need in this puzzle, right? As the one piece. What made it stand out as one piece to convince you, all right, this is what we need as the elements to really get this going?
Yeah, great question. So let me kind of just quickly explain what the checker nodes were, and maybe why that's important. For those listeners that may be unaware, a few months ago, maybe 6 months ago now, Aethir did a node sale, right? And it was very, very successful. I think still, the biggest node sale that's kind of happened in Web3. We raised, somewhere in the region of 42,000 ETH, right? So, $100+ million. And it was an insanely successful process. And the reason was, I think, because of the value that being an operator of a checker node within the Aethir ecosystem had, right? So what is a checker? Well, from day one, Aethir has always had three participants within their network. The first is what we call the GPU provider, right? So obviously the GPU itself, the engine of our network. The second is the checker. That is the participant within the network that's, I call them the police force, right? They're ensuring that if you say you're an H100, you're actually an H100. You're telling me you've done this job, the checker will check that you did the job. You're asking the network to pay you out, the checker will check that you've lodged the correct request, right? They're the police force of the ecosystem. And then the third role is what we call the indexer, and the indexer does kind of matchmaking between users and compute requests within the ecosystem, a much smaller role. Anyway, when we were kind of progressing through our go-to-market, this was all pre-TGE. When we were progressing in our go-to-market, what we realized was that one of the greatest benefits that deep-in projects have are their ability to tap into retail, right? If you're a render network, right, early on, render network, anyone could connect their GPU to the render ecosystem and start earning render tokens. That's such a powerful narrative for your community, because anyone that's got a GPU now becomes a render maxi, right? They want the token to pump because it means that they'll earn more from their idle computer. But at Aethir, we made this commitment to being enterprise only. So we were totally excluding retail from participating in the broader Aethir model. So we were kind of asking ourselves, how do we bring people in? How do we create this opportunity for participation for retail in what we're building? And the concept of effectively selling licenses to do work within the network became this checker node sale. And it's really the perfect sort of match, right? Because it's decentralizing the police force. What better way to create trust within your network than making the community the police force, separating police and state, right? We're not Aethir policing ourselves, right? Because that's, in some ways, I mean, that's what the centralized world does. But in some ways, that's a bit cheeky, right? I think having your community police your actions is a far more decentralized operation. On top of that, rewarding people for their work without the need for a very, very expensive GPU was something that we really liked the idea of. I think the best mental model to understand what a node sale is the yellow taxi in kind of New York, right? Everyone knows the yellow taxi. It's very famous, right? To get a yellow taxi, you need to buy what's called a medallion, a taxi medallion. It's often, a couple of $100,000 to purchase it. And once you buy that taxi medallion, you can have a yellow taxi. You've got permission to drive a yellow taxi in the system. But if you just have that yellow taxi and it sits in your driveway at your home and you don't drive it, you're not earning any money, right? Just because you own the license to that yellow taxi doesn't mean you will earn any reward from holding that license. You actually need to get out and drive it. And that's exactly what a node sale gives people the ability to access, right? It's a license to purchase the trust to operate in a network and do work that will be rewarded by the ecosystem. And people love the idea.
100%. And I mean, devil's advocate that is overused these days. I mean, obviously they play some function, right? And why I'm saying this, I mean, shameless plug, we're going to do a node sale in November as well. But aside of that, I think it's actually a great mechanism, as you mentioned, to get the community going as well. And if you don't mind, I'm actually going to use that policing and yellow cab analogy. I really love it.
Please. Yeah. And feel free to use this one too. In your community, hashtag send nodes, right? Send nodes. People love it. It'll get everyone fired up about nodes.
Love it. Okay, Mark. So I think let's come to an end here. We're over time anyway. Closing remarks. I actually want to ask you two questions before we drop. So number one is, what is a big misconception that people have about gaming or AI that you would like to clear up?
Yeah, that's a good one. I'm glad you asked this question, right? I think the biggest misconception with decentralized compute networks is that there is no co-location for the hardware within the network, right? So for those for those out there that maybe aren't super familiar with the way that AI infrastructure works, if you want to build, for example, a ChatGPT, right? You need a large amount of hardware, but that hardware needs to be adjacent to each other. It needs to effectively be in one single location, right? We call it co-located, right? The hardware needs to be co-located. That's so that all of the machines that are working on this AI task can communicate with each other instantaneously. There isn't a delay when they're communicating with another server that's across the country or whatever. But when people hear the word decentralized, they always assume that that means every individual piece of hardware is in a different location. And like I mentioned earlier, definitely decentralized networks are more distributed, 100%. That's an advantage that those networks have. But that doesn't mean that there aren't large amounts of the hardware within networks like Aethir that are co-located and ready for large training runs or inferencing workloads. And that's something that I think a lot of people have a misconception about. Actually, the vast majority of Aethir's high performance compute exists in a co-located form. I would say that there's probably not a single H100, right? Just like one H100 that's sitting by itself anywhere within Aethir network. It's always adjacent to a number of others. And certainly we have some very, very large clusters within our network as well. So that's a big misconception that I'm happy to clear up.
Makes a lot of sense, and I can subscribe to that as well. I mean, we're mostly operating out of data centers, and within each data centers, there might be one or two or even more providers that co-locate outside of the data center, right? I mean, it makes a lot of sense. If it's a great data center with a lot of connections, a lot of cities around it, why not? Okay, Mark. So as a closing remark, thoughts from your side, key takeaways, anything that we haven't discussed yet, anything you want to have the listener take away from our 45 minutes-ish here?
Yeah, I think we did quickly mention briefly the Aethir Edge. So I would love to touch on that. The Aethir Edge is actually a physical enterprise AI device that users can buy, right? And effectively what you're doing, we partnered with Qualcomm, and this device you can purchase and it'll sit in your home. You plug into your Wi-Fi, you plug into your power, and it will actually operate as a node within Aethir's network, taking advantage of this kind of edge bandwidth infrastructure that you're plugged into. And Aethir will actually reward you, well for providing that enterprise node within our network. So anyone that's kind of interested or loves hardware or likes the idea of being able to, buy and provide AI infrastructure into Aethir's network, definitely check that out. You can go to myedge.io and you can get access to these devices. Something that'll become increasingly important as more and more AI applications come online, and the need to have this real-time, low latency, instantaneous interaction with AI becomes increasingly important.
And fun fact, that's actually how we met, because I remember approaching you after demonstrating, unveiling this Aethir Edge. Like, what's this all about?
That's it.
plus minus half a year later, here we are.
Yeah, man, you guys have done incredibly well. I'm glad that we're both here, pretty much a year later with the success that we've both had. Very, very excited for your node sale. I know how legit you guys are and what you're building. So pumped for that. Definitely send me, and the Aethir team more information. But I'm excited.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it a lot. Thanks also for jumping on the call. Thanks everybody for listening in. Looking forward to take this to the next level, Mark.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks very much, Seb.